guests. I have been chomping at the bit to have a conversation on AI and many of the elements associated with it. And so my next guest, Dr. Elkins, she was nice enough to join me. She is a professor of humanities and comparative literature at Kenyon College, where she also works in AI research. Her work explores the intersection of artificial intelligence, literature, and human creativity, examining how AI is reshaping storytelling, education, and even the way we think about art and history. Dr. Elkins, thank you for this. Welcome to the show. How are you doing this morning?
I'm great. How are you doing? Thanks for having me.
I'm doing great. The reason why I wanted to have this conversation is because of what has been taking place with DeepSeek. We had OpenAI, hundreds of billions of dollars that were apparently invested into it. DeepSeek comes out, and almost overnight, $1 trillion in market share across the AI thing just goes up in smoke because they were able to build that system for about, I think it was like $10 million compared to hundreds of millions of dollars that were invested into some of the other systems itself. Let's start at the beginning. How, from your take in looking out into the future in regards to how does this stuff, or how do you think this is going to impact society? What impact do you think AI is going to have on society? Do you think it's as radical of an impact as people think it is? People often call it the Oppenheimer moment, basically like the nuclear bomb or Sputnik, the satellite going into space, and people are shocked by the technical proficiency associated with it. Do you think AI also is a similar, let's say, a similar radical event in world history in regards to its impact?
I do. The question is, when is that key point, right? Because everybody's asking how long till we have incredibly performant AI. And the reality is none of us know, right? So there are all kinds of projections. I will say, as someone who's been working with this since 2019, that it is continual progress. Started working with ChatGPT, actually before it was ChatGPT, GPT-2 in 2019. The minute I worked with it, I thought, oh my gosh, this is incredible. So it is going to radically change everything. I think the main change is we tend to associate intelligence, creativity as kind of our last key human traits that cannot be automated. And some people are calling this cognitive automation, right? So who's going to be most affected? It's those people who are already working in the creative fields, who are intelligence workers, who are really going to be affected by this. How quickly, how fast? That is the question that everybody's asking, and no one really knows.
Oh, it is fascinating. I mean, I did software engineering for about 10 years. I have no idea how they're able to do what they're doing with these large language models. It is astonishing. I mean, it effectively passes the Turing test, where you can have a conversation with this device. And yeah, there are hallucinations where the device says something, it's like Bob Cobb created the corn cob in 1925. Okay, well, that's not really true, but it would say it very strongly, as if it is true. So you get the hallucinations, but there's also this element that these things, the knowledge at their disposal that they can pull together in order to relay is astonishing. And it's like when you add in this other element of building stuff. So if I say, I'm giving a template, or I'm giving a storyboard to an AI, and I'd say, Santa Claus comes down the chimney at 2 a.m, he eats cookies, and he runs out the window. Okay, well, it can build that. And in the process of building it, it has to come up with, what does Santa Claus look like? What does the chimney look like? All of these were decisions that a human being would have had to make at one point in order to construct this story and this image. It does it automatically. That's astonishing. I mean, that gets into this notion of, it's not creativity in the exact sense, because all things being equal is just pulling information that was already in its database. But it kind of is on some level, because you didn't necessarily program each and every one of those elements in. Those elements are kind of being brought to life based on its interpretation of what you're telling it. I find that to be astonishing. And you're right, this is going to hit the arts, acting, even on YouTube, where you have like these kind of AI programs that are mimicking human beings in relaying information to an audience that may not necessarily know that those things are AI. I mean, I'm fascinated by this. What impact do you think this is going to have? Let's take out the win, because as you pointed out, we don't know the win.
Yeah.
But what do you think that impact is going to be across the board, either in screenwriting, either in business, either in even something as basic as transportation? Let's say like a car that can go from point A to point B where you don't necessarily need a driver associated with it.
Yeah.
How wide ranging do you think that impact is going to end up being in our society?
I think it's going to be very wide ranging. The big question is robotics, right? Because robotics, we thought we were going to have robots long before we had bots. And in fact, our bots have been more performant than our robots. So right now we're seeing a renaissance in robotics. The robotics is that real question mark, right?
Mhm.
Are we going to be able to embody this intelligence in something that can act and move in the outside world? Okay, so let's start with the creatives. I'm worried for those screenwriters. You know, they got 3 years on their contract. We have done some testing of screenwriting. Other, industry has done it. It is definitely creative. The question is, what do we mean by creativity? And there are all kinds of questions out here. And actually, right now, it's a very real question. Can this do things that it's never seen before? Is it really creative?
Right.
Certainly in the case of AlphaGo, that's that early, a couple years ago, AI that beat the best Go player in the world. Okay.
Right.
So the way they did that is finally they stopped training the AI on humans, playing humans, and actually trained it on itself. Once they trained it on itself, it made this move while playing that everybody thought was the dumbest move ever. They had never seen it. No human would ever do it. It turned out to be the winning move of the game, but it was unrecognizable to humans. So the real question for language and for these LLMs that we have right now is, how would we train it on itself instead of humans? Because right now it's limited, right, to that human information. There's also a larger question about creativity, and that is this question of, is creativity something that has never been done before, or are most people who are creative just remixing, using their life experience, using what they've seen? And I think most of us would agree that the vast majority of creativity is just building on what's already been done.
Right.
So for creatives, I think we definitely have a real question. Business has been kind of interesting because we haven't seen it take off as quickly as people expected. One of the reasons is that businesses have really been primed to use what we call structured data. So everything is set up in spreadsheets, it's numeric, it's all this kind of data. And suddenly they have these systems that are really good with all kinds of data that are in the form of videos and images and text transcripts. And we never really could use that before. So businesses weren't really adapted for that kind of data. Most businesses were really caught flat-footed, right? Because they don't have that kind of data to use. And so that transition has really been tricky. The other tricky thing is, all these businesses want to hire AI people to come in and help them transition, but there are very few people who can do it. That's changing. There are a huge number of people coming into the field. A lot of people who were in adjacent fields are moving over. But, a really good AI programmer, we're talking the same kinds of salaries as like a top NFL player, right? Maybe not top, but, certainly a very good NFL player, right? So, we're talking about those kinds of salaries. So businesses have been a little bit slower than we thought. Very, very hard to track exactly how many people are not being replaced. The tech industry is seeing a big hit in terms of trying to cut. So we're really kind of watching that business sector. Transportation is interesting because here we have a situation in which people get very worked up about a single accident with a self-driving car. And yet there are so many accidents every day with humans driving cars.
Right.
And so the question there is, how much better does a self-driving car have to be than a human for us to tolerate it, right? Is it 10 times better, 100 times better? Because really, the number of accidents we're seeing is small, but when we have one with a self-driving car, of course, it makes the news and everybody is horrified.
Yeah. It's like the ghost in the machine.
Yeah.
We're okay with a human being killing people, but if it's a car, oh, that's too far. That's too far.
Right. That's right.
What's wild about it, as a software engineer, I remember working in the company and building systems that would have eliminated jobs at the company. Would they eventually repurpose people into other different areas? But that is a real thing. Like, our society hasn't necessarily caught up with the speed and the pace at which this kind of technological proficiency is taking place. And at some point, invariably, there will be a car that goes from point A to point B where you don't need a person. There will be a checkout counter where you don't need a person. I mean, we can see it now, the way they have checkout counters set up where you might have maybe 3 lines, but the rest of them are effectively self checkout. Eventually, there'll be stores where a person can walk in and it would automatically ping the person's credit card or whatever in order to get the money from the person, where they don't necessarily need to interact with anyone. This stuff is coming. Do you see any kind of changes? And maybe this goes beyond the scope of this conversation, but any kind of legal changes, any kind of changes in the way that AI is being, let's say, engaged in order to make society that much more prepared for the eventuality of its rollout? And I hope that makes sense. I'm trying to get at this thing of the unpreparedness of society to be able to accommodate these kind of new technological innovations that are coming down the pike. I mean, even from just the capitalistic standpoint of how do we maximize our profit? And we can maximize our profit by utilizing this technology as opposed to having to hire new and additional people. There's a political consequence to that is going to be felt in our political space. I haven't seen anything that they've done to try to accommodate that yet. But to be fair, I don't work in this field constantly anymore. Have you seen them making any kind of adjustments, any kind of plans, any kind of movements on this at all?
Well, we certainly saw it with the Biden administration. There was an executive order. And in that executive order, there was a concern with questions about labor. There are a lot of researchers looking at the future of work, trying to predict how much are we seeing, how much is it going to be affected. I think one of the problems is we have a story that we tell, which is that every new technology makes people worried. But they're always worried for nothing. And in fact, there are new jobs that are produced, right? And it's just a question of upskilling or training for those new jobs. So there's a saying out there, you'll only be replaced if you don't know how to use AI, but the people who know how to use AI will not be, they'll still have jobs. Well, the
Right.
fact of the matter is, as AI becomes better, we're going to need fewer and fewer of those people using it. And we're already looking cutting edge. I don't know if you've been watching this, but these agents that will be able to go out and do things autonomously without a human in the loop.
Right.
So in my lab, we've already experimented with students applying to jobs, 500 jobs, with tailoring the cover letter and the CV for every
Really?
job. Mm-hmm.
So this
Yeah.
would be considered, what is it? Artificial General Intelligence, AGI, I
It's
believe.
not AGI, it's called agents. And
Okay.
you actually have a network of agents. So you have many agents performing these tasks. So in this case, you had agents that were autonomously reading the jobs, deciding if it was a good fit, and tailoring the CV and the cover letter to each job and submitting it. Right. So,
Wow.
right. You can imagine what kind of effect this is going to have as we have these agents. And so that is a real concern because we no longer really have a human in the loop.
Right.
We no longer have a person going, yes, apply for this job. That looks good. And so we're going to have these agents that are going to really change things up, assuming that they're not regulated, assuming that they're not considered unsafe. I mean, there are all kinds of questions here.
Mm-hmm. That's terrifying on some level. That's what for the job thing. The job thing, that's great because that's busy work. Like, that's work that you don't really want to do anyway.
Right.
Like, if I could say, okay, go out and find me a job, and this is what I'm looking for, and it says, okay, and it goes out and it comes back to say, okay, I've applied to all of these 100 companies in this particular area. This was the range of which I did so, and it says, thank you very much. I didn't want to spend 5 hours doing it, so God bless that you were able to do it for me.
Exactly.
It gets terrifying when it gets to things like governments, because you can imagine. I made an example. Sock puppet accounts. So there are accounts that effectively use anonymity of the internet in order to, let's say, drive certain ideas, drive certain, let's say, political objectives. That because at that point you have the cover of anonymity, and nobody knows who you are. For all intents and purposes, when someone sees an account, they just assume there's a person running that account. That is not always true. And if you're talking about like covert stuff, okay, well, what does it look like when you have an agent that can go and do this with no ghost in the machine? It is effectively this kind of artificial intelligence that is effective, that is affecting something, whatever that something is, for whatever particular reason it is, and you don't even need a person in the mix, in the process. That is terrifying to me. I'll give you an example. Say, for example, you had a repressive government, and that government wanted to follow certain people, or let's say not even a repressive government. Let's say you had a police action that was taking place, and the rule goes out that says, okay, we need you to follow this person. And so we need you to follow this person everywhere this person may goes. We want to have this automated process of keeping track, paying attention to, and watching. Meaning I, as an individual, don't necessarily have to oversee it. I now have this ghost that is going through and doing all of this action for me and keeping a note of what is taking place. That freaks me out. Like, where that goes is very terrifying to me. And I don't necessarily know if there's been any kind of legislation trying to deal with, let's say, the ramifications of what AI could do. Not necessarily just in a workspace, but also in, I guess, this kind of public policy, what's allowed in public policy standpoint. Or maybe if I'm wrong, correct me if I'm wrong, though.
So there is the UK AI Safety Institute, also the US AI Safety Institute. So everybody is looking at this, trying to figure out what to do.
They're thinking about it. Yeah.
It is very, very tricky. And this is very, very complicated. And you need people who understand the technology well enough to anticipate all the different ways that it's going to be used. I'll tell you something that worries me that's not really on the radar, I feel, of enough people. You talked about surveillance. Mm-hmm. Right now we have young people feeding in all kinds of personal data into these systems. And there's a lot of talk about not using that data to train the new AIs, because you don't want suddenly some AI to slip up and give your personal information to somebody else, right? Because it's trained on it. But actually, what concerns me more is that all these private companies are collecting all of this personal data on people, and it's good enough to actually be able to predict personality traits, disability aspects. If it told one of my students, it predicted that they had ADHD.
Really?
Yeah. And we also can, from language, predict somebody's emotional state, somebody's, personality. So some of my students, it was an experiment on Twitter, and I had all of my class do it, actually ask, what are my worst characteristics? What are my biggest weaknesses? It is brutal. And actually pretty accurate, so that I've told my students, have your therapist nearby, have a friend nearby.
Wait. So, okay, this is fantastic to me. So how does it, it's this objective assessment. What it put me in mind of, if you're playing chess online or chess.com, there's this, they have a analysis engine that goes along with you playing the game.
Yeah.
And I remember I was telling my audience as I was playing online one day, how it would give this kind of brutal assessment when it thinks you've done something wrong, where you just see the number like drops. That is fantastic to me. So are you putting this information in, or is it analyzing your social media? So is it going through your social media, your YouTube channel, your Twitter account, your Facebook account?
No, it's just these conversations. It's just these conversations, but you have to realize that young people are asking it advice on how to handle tricky situations. Right. So it's getting all of this information about what is stressing the person out. What are they upset about? What do they need to talk about? I mean, people are having these kinds of relationships with it. I don't think it's anthropomorphizing. There's all of this conversation about, we shouldn't anthropomorphize. All of my students know this is an AI. That's actually exactly why they talk to it, because it's an AI. But we have to realize these companies now have all of this data on all of these individuals that are essentially psychological profiles. And the reason why that's worrisome is that once you understand somebody's psychological profile, you can predict their behavior better, and ultimately you can manipulate their behavior better. So I'm not saying anybody would intentionally do this, but nobody is talking about the fact that universities are signing up for subscriptions. All of the students have access. They are feeding in all of this data. All right. And even if it's not being used to train the models, we are essentially capturing incredibly private and key data on people.
Oh, that is fascinating. on sci-fi series all the time, you would see where the person is talking to the computer and it would say, hey, are you okay? Your mental state seems to be so-and-so, or your blood pressure has increased. This is indicative of so-and-so, where they're effectively doing this kind of psychological analysis of the individual based on what the person is saying, or what is the context of what's taking place. It sounds like what you're saying is that is real. That is effectively the way these things can operate if indeed they're programmed to do that. That is astonishing.
It's only based on your language and the kinds of conversations that you're having with it. But if you did sync it up with somebody's smartwatch and biometric data,
It's more.
it definitely would have a lot more information. And one of the things that worries me as someone who works in effective AI is that we're some pretty prominent figures who are saying, oh, this tech doesn't work. It's pretty hard to predict emotions. It's getting better and better. And I actually worry that we need more people focused on it. It's the same issue with everybody saying, oh, it's hype. It's not that great. I mean, as you pointed out, there are certainly issues. But if everybody thinks it's hype, we're not focused enough on, as it gets better, what we're going to do. So all of this kind of data is going to be a real issue. You know, you mentioned surveillance. There's another really interesting question here. For AI to be good, we have to feed it more data. And there's some communities for whom we don't have a lot of data, and it actually performs worse. Well, the big question becomes, do we want to feed it more data? You know, the Black community, I know there was a lot of outcry in Oakland at one point where the Black community said, we don't want to be surveyed. Maybe it's good that facial recognition doesn't work well on us, right? Okay, but here's the thing. Then it's not a good predictor and then it won't work well. So if you want an AI that actually is going to work well, we need to feed it that data. But maybe some communities should be saying, I don't want it to work that well on my community. I don't want it to have that data. So we have a real tension between wanting to feed it data about certain communities so that it understands those communities and can work with those communities better. And then the thought, wait a minute, do we really want it to have data on some of these communities? It's really tricky, and people decide on both sides of it. You know, the indigenous community, there's a group called Indigenous AI, and they are very worried about their data, their cultural data, who owns it, feeding it into an AI, who's going to have access to that. Then I talked to other communities. I was talking with a colleague in France. Believe it or not, there are 100 dying languages in France. And she's very concerned if we don't train models on those languages, the kids in those families will not use those languages and they're going to die out. So she wants all of those languages preserved, right? So right now, we really have this fork in the path where, you know, we have to ask, do we want all of that data? Do we want it more performant? Do we want it to understand all of our different cultures and communities? Or do some communities reserve the right to say, not here, we don't want it to work as well. We're okay with that. Don't take our data.
That is fascinating. I mean, because there is a creepy element associated with this notion that this thing is always watching, and there is some kind of mind behind it that's not necessarily a human mind, but some kind of calculation that's taking place behind it. That is fascinating. I mean, oh, it's a mixed bag. I can totally see someone who's, let's say, in emotional distress, being talked down by a model that can engage that person in a way that makes sense. It comes across given this kind of appearance of humanity, even if it's not necessarily real, but still having an actual emotional impact on that person to the positive. I can also see how it's super creepy to have these things always observing, always watching. That is, it's a mixed bag, I suppose. I guess it's like any other technology. And also, very rarely is there a real conversation about it where the public gets to have its say on these issues, especially for something that's emergent like this. Oh,
I think that's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And how do we get more people involved? First, you have to understand what it's doing, how it works, and what the risks are. But I think most people will take that convenience of having those conversations, having that coach, having that mentor. You know, most of my students don't care about privacy. They think, you know, there's no privacy anymore anyway. You know, so I think, you know, you're not really thinking about the big picture that we are essentially allowing private companies to gather huge amounts of data on humans.
Yeah, that's a new norm. It wasn't that way before. It's like with the advent of the web and all of this information being out, everybody has a YouTube video, everybody has a Twitter account, everybody has a TikTok, all of this stuff. Yeah, that's a new norm. From your take, let's go into that for a moment. How do these work? How does it put together this kind of sentence structure? Like if I go and say, create, I'll give you an example. One of the pictures that I did for the channel was I would put in African American with rounded glasses, a federo, holding a Star Wars lightsaber, fighting an eagle jumping off of a cliff on a wingsuit. And it would build it. It would build all of it out. It would put me in a suit. It would do all of that stuff. Meaning on some level, it has to be able to understand, and I don't mean understand in a human way, but understand what is being said, meaning it understands whatever symbols that are being used in order to mean something else. Bring that stuff together in regards to some kind of language, and then spit out what it understands of what you communicated to it. How is it doing that? How is it putting that stuff together and crafting, I guess, this image or crafting the story based upon what you told it? How does that work?
Yeah, let's start with the language. That the large language models really, are what took off. Interestingly, here, people had worked on language for a very, very long time, and the way they were trying to do it was using grammar. This was based on Noam Chomsky and the idea that we have an underlying grammar that's universal. If we can teach grammar and all of these rules, we will ultimately get a machine to understand language and generate language. And that turned out to work very, very poorly. The really amazing thing about these models is what we found out is we can just take a ton of data, feed that data into a machine. The machine kind of learns by trying to predict what the next word is. And when it doesn't do a good job, it then sees what the next word is and adjusts. It adjusts these weights, right, in the model. It just learns from the data. So this is called Sutton's bitter lesson, that we can engineer all we want with all the information we have and all the knowledge we have. But sometimes all you need is a massive amount of data, and you throw that data at the machine, much like a child is just exposed to all of this data. And it just learns better that way.
That's super interesting. I mean, because that's effectively a database, and you are coming up with a probability of what comes up next. So it's like, as I'm looking through, like if I had to build that, I guess I would look and say, okay, what is the percentage, or what has the highest percentage of coming next as the next word in this list? And you would have a database of all of that information of what comes next. Okay, this one has a 75% chance of coming up, in which case this is the one that the word or that the computer is going to predict is going to be next. God, man, that is a massive amount of data, though.
So sometimes people call it a fuzzy database because it's not actually storing that data. We are passing the data through the model, but it's not keeping any of it. There's no archive. There's no place it goes to look up. So it's kind of like memorizing, sort of. And that's why sometimes if it's seen something a lot, it does actually kind of memorize. But if it's only seen things a couple times, it's fuzzier, right? About how it knows that. The other
Wait, you lost me on that one. You got to explain that.
Yeah.
What do you mean fuzzy? Like, what's the, like, it has to be stored somewhere, right? Or am I wrong on this?
No, does not store anything. It is just, it's loosely modeled on your brain. Where are all your memories? Where are they stored? There's no place we can go and just peer it, right? You've got these synaptic, these neurons, these connections. It's stored in the strength of those connections and which ones are most likely to fire. So there's no storage. There's no storage. But we do see, if you ask it, this was a big deal with the image generation. If you ask it to generate something it's seen thousands of pictures of, some celebrity, it's more likely going to be able to do an exact generation of that because it's sort of kind of memorized. The real thing is we sort of understand how these work, but we don't fully. Their explainability and transparency in these systems is a huge deal. And it's also a huge deal for copyright because it's more like going to a museum seeing some paintings on a wall, going home and painting a painting, right? You're allowed to do that. You're not allowed to store that painting.
Right.
You're not allowed to directly copy it. But in fact, this is just like it's seen all of this data. So our current copyright laws really don't account for the complexity of how these things work.
Oh, that is fascinating. That is fascinating. I guess the last question before I let you go, if you had to, you pointed out that one of your big concerns is that this information is effectively, all of these kids, all of their information is effectively online. They don't necessarily see the issue with privacy concerns because, frankly, they grew up in a world where privacy wasn't really an issue for them. They volunteer their information out for the world to see, all of their images, all of their pictures. Here's me and Uncle Junebug. I think I even have an ass picture on Instagram, for God's sake, when I was like traveling and bored in a hotel by myself. Like all of this stuff, we just do this stuff, on our own. We're not prodded for this. What if you had to come up with a concern beyond that one? What would be the biggest concern that you have moving forward on the issue of AI? I know some people pointed out they think this is going to try to take over the world. Some people are concerned about Terminators. Black Mirror reflecting our fears back at us at the robot dogs that effectively went on a killing spree, destroying all of humanity. It was like a bad code that went through and it started killing people off. If you had to make a choice about what is your greatest concern, I mean, you work with these things all the time, what would be that main concern moving forward?
I'm concerned about labor, as you mentioned. Political instability happens when people who've traditionally had power lose it. And we're definitely going to see, as with any technology, that people who benefited from earlier technologies may not benefit from this one. I'm less concerned right now about the whole Terminator idea. I think we've got enough to worry about with automation and with the capture of data. That's a lot. So we still have a lot on our plate, I think, to try to figure out.
Wow. Dr. Katherine Elkins. Am I pronouncing your last name correct? Elkins?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Dr. Katherine Elkins. She's a professor of humanities and comparative literature at Kenyon College, where she also works in AI research. Her work explores the intersection of artificial intelligence, literature, and human creativity, examining how AI is reshaping storytelling, education, and even the way we think about art and history. Dr. Elkins, thank you for this. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you. It was great.
You do great. Have a good one.
Bye.
Oh,